I'll never forget the sound of her palm hitting my face. It wasn't just the sting. It was the laughter that followed, the kind that crawls into your chest and sits there, gnawing away at whatever dignity you have left. I stood there, staring at her. Lillian, my wife. She looked so satisfied, so smug, like she had just accomplished some great feat, and Marcus, her boyfriend, yes, I said boyfriend, was grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Around them, their so-called friends, a collection of high-pitched voices and smug faces, erupted into laughter that echoed through the lavish living room. Let me rewind a bit. This wasn't a random slap from a wife fed up with her husband. Oh no, this was calculated. Or at least she thought it was. You see, Lillian had been seeing Marcus behind my back for months. I found out weeks ago. And instead of confronting her immediately, I waited. I observed. I watched her lie to me with a straight face, telling me she was working late or catching up with friends. And all the while, I knew she was slipping off to meet him, playing the role of a faithful wife only when it suited her. So why was I here? In this house I didn't recognize, surrounded by people who looked at me like I was the punchline of some elaborate joke? Because I wanted her to show me who she truly was. I wanted her to drop the mask completely, to reveal the depths of her betrayal. And oh, did she deliver? She slapped me because I dared to show up. Because I ruined her little fantasy of living a double life without consequences. I had walked into that room with no warning, my heart pounding but my face calm. I scanned the room, taking in the sight of her curled up on the couch next to Marcus, her hand resting casually on his thigh as if I didn't exist. Marcus, for his part, smirked at me like he owned her, like I was some pathetic nuisance interrupting their fun. I'd barely opened my mouth to speak when Lillian stood up, all righteous indignation, and slapped me across the face. "What are you doing here, Michael?" she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You don't belong here." The room exploded with laughter. I remember locking eyes with Marcus. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. "Look at him," he said, leaning back as if I were nothing more than entertainment. "Can you believe this guy? Walking in here like he owns the place." I could feel the anger bubbling under my skin, but I didn't let it show. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my watch. A quick glance told me I had 4 minutes left. 4 minutes before the real show began. I didn't bother explaining myself. What was the point? They wouldn't listen. They were too busy basking in their arrogance. "You're pathetic," Lillian said, her voice rising above the laughter. "No wonder I had to find someone else. Look at you, standing there like a lost puppy. Do you even have anything to say for yourself?" I did, but not yet. Instead, I took a deep breath and let the room settle around me. The laughter was still going, though it was starting to wane, the sharp edges of mockery dulling into murmurs. They were waiting for me to explode, to lash out, to make a scene. But I wasn't going to give them that. No, I had something far better planned. I looked at Lillian, really looked at her, and for a moment, I felt nothing. No love, no anger, not even sadness. Just a strange, hollow detachment. "Enjoy this moment," I said, my voice steady and calm, "because it's the last one you'll have." That threw them. For a brief second, the room went quiet. But then Marcus laughed, a deep, condescending chuckle that spread like wildfire. "You hear that, Lil? He's making threats now. Real tough guy." I checked my watch again. 3 minutes left. I smiled, just a small, knowing curve of my lips. And then I sat down, poured myself a drink from their expensive bar, and waited. The slap? It didn't matter anymore. The laughter? It was background noise. Because in 3 minutes, everything was going to change. I sat there, swirling their overpriced whiskey in the glass, pretending to savor it like some connoisseur. Truth was, I could barely taste it over the adrenaline pounding in my veins. 3 minutes. That's all I had to endure. Just 3 more minutes of this circus before the curtains would fall. You're probably wondering why I didn't just flip the table, scream, or demand answers. Believe me, I wanted to. But what would that have accomplished? An outburst would have given them the satisfaction they craved. A dramatic scene to ridicule for years. No, I needed to be smarter, colder. I had spent weeks setting this trap, and I wasn't about to ruin it with misplaced emotions. See, this wasn't the first time I'd been humiliated by Lillian, though it was the first time she had the nerve to do it so publicly. For months, I'd been watching her lies unfold like a poorly written soap opera. The late nights, the whispered phone calls, the sudden interest in spa weekends and gym memberships. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. That's what love does. It blinds you, makes you doubt your instincts. But then I found the receipts. Literal receipts. Dinner for two at fancy restaurants. Hotel bookings under a fake name. Jewelry I never saw her wear. I even overheard her on the phone once, whispering to someone about how she couldn't wait to see him again. My chest tightened. My hands trembled, but I said nothing. Instead, I hired someone, a private investigator. And let me tell you, what he uncovered wasn't just infidelity. It was betrayal on a level I never thought possible. Marcus, the man sitting across the room, lounging like a king. He wasn't just her boyfriend. He was her partner in crime. Literally. They were siphoning money from our joint accounts. Little by little, so subtly that I hadn't noticed until the investigator showed me the statements. But the worst part? She wasn't even hiding it well. She had grown so confident, so arrogant, that she stopped covering her tracks entirely. It was almost like she wanted to get caught, like she enjoyed the thrill of walking the tightrope. Well, tonight, that rope was going to snap. I checked my watch again. 2 minutes. I could feel their eyes on me, curious, irritated. Marcus leaned forward, his smirk widening. What's the matter, champ? Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing you don't belong here? I took another sip, letting his words wash over me like the meaningless noise they were. My silence was getting to them. Lillian's friends, who had been laughing moments ago, started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even Lillian's bravado faltered. She hated when she couldn't predict me. "What are you even doing here, Michael?" she snapped, her voice sharper than before. "You don't have the guts to confront me, so what's your plan? Stand there and pout like a child?" I glanced at her, meeting her glare with a calm that seemed to unnerve her. "I'm just here to watch," I said. "Watch what?" she barked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Your world collapse," I replied, my tone flat, almost bored. Her laugh was forced, shaky. "You're delusional." Maybe, but I knew one thing for certain. She was running out of time. I had orchestrated every detail of this evening with surgical precision. From the moment she slapped me, the countdown had begun. The paramedics, already on standby, alerted to a mysterious incident at this address. The police, en route, with an anonymous tip about illegal activities. And the drinks? Well, let's just say I had help ensuring they would create the perfect storm of chaos. I wasn't out for revenge. No, revenge implies emotion, anger, bitterness, a need to hurt. This wasn't about that. This was about balance, about showing Lillian and her circle of arrogance that actions have consequences. 1 minute. I set my glass down and leaned back, letting a small smile creep onto my face. They didn't notice the shift in my demeanor, too busy trying to figure out why I wasn't reacting the way they expected. Lillian's friends whispered among themselves, their laughter now tinged with unease. "Why are you smiling?" Lillian demanded, her voice shaking just enough to betray her fear. "You'll see," I said simply. 45 seconds. The tension in the room was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus, who had been so smug moments ago, narrowed his eyes at me, suspicion flickering across his face. "What the hell is this, man?" he asked, his voice losing its edge. I didn't answer. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked at each of them in turn. "You've had your fun," I said. "Now it's my turn." The whiskey glass was still in my hand when the laughter began to die down. The room, once alive with mocking voices, now settled into an uneasy quiet. It was subtle at first. Glances exchanged, whispered words barely audible. They didn't know it yet, but they felt it, the shift in power. Lillian's smugness was the last to falter. She stood there, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was an insect she regretted not crushing sooner. "What are you trying to prove, Michael?" she sneered, her tone filled with faux authority. You're embarrassing yourself? Embarrassing myself? Right. Because I was the one who brought my husband to a party filled with my lover and their hangers-on. The irony was almost funny, but I wasn't in the mood to laugh. Instead, I let my gaze drift past her, deliberately focusing on Marcus. He was trying to look unbothered, slouched back in his chair with one arm draped over the backrest. But his eyes told a different story. He was watching me closely now, no longer confident in the narrative he'd been spinning in his head. He's not here for a fight, his posture said, but he's not leaving either. The friends, her little chorus of enablers, were even worse. They'd started with loud, obnoxious laughter, but now they were fidgeting. One of them, a woman with a laugh like a car alarm, cleared her throat awkwardly and glanced at the door. Another, a man whose name I hadn't bothered to learn, shifted in his seat and muttered something to the person beside him. I checked my watch again. 90 seconds. Just enough time to push them a little further. You know, I began, swirling the whiskey lazily in the glass. It's funny how quiet things get when the laughter stops. Marcus snorted, but it lacked conviction. What's that supposed to mean? I looked at him, long and hard. It means you've been running your mouth all night, but now you're wondering if you've gone too far. That hit a nerve. His smirk faltered, and he sat up straighter. What are you saying, man? He asked, his voice carrying a hint of unease. Oh, you'll find out soon enough, I replied, letting the words hang in the air. Lillian stepped forward, cutting off whatever Marcus was about to say. Enough with the cryptic nonsense, Michael, she snapped, her voice cracking slightly. If you've got something to say, just say it. I turned my gaze to her, and for a moment, I let her see everything I'd been holding back. The hurt, the betrayal, the sheer disbelief that the woman I once loved could stoop so low. She flinched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. What's the rush, Lil? I asked, my tone light, almost playful. Afraid of what might happen if I take my time? Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might slap me again. But instead, she turned to Marcus. He's just trying to mess with us, she said, more to herself than to him. Ignore him. Marcus didn't look so sure. Maybe, he said slowly, his eyes flicking to the friends who were now visibly uncomfortable. But what if he's not? That was the moment the tension became unbearable. The air in the room was thick with it, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone except me. Lillian's friends started murmuring again, their voices low and hurried. I caught snippets of their conversation. What's going on? Do you think he called the cops? Maybe we should leave. I smiled. They were already cracking, and I hadn't even done anything yet. Lillian spun back toward me, her patience clearly wearing thin. You think this is funny? She demanded, her voice rising. Coming here, ruining my night, playing these stupid games? Funny? I repeated, leaning back in my chair. No, Lillian, I don't think it's funny. I think it's sad. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge at me. But before she could respond, one of her friends, the man who'd been shifting uncomfortably in his seat, stood up. I don't know about you guys, he said, his voice shaking slightly, but I'm not sticking around for this. No one's going anywhere, I said calmly, setting the whiskey glass down on the table. All eyes turned to me. The tension, already unbearable, spiked. Lillian's friends froze, unsure whether to defy me or stay put. Marcus leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. What did you do? He demanded, his voice low and threatening. I checked my watch one last time. 30 seconds. I let a small smile curve my lips. You'll find out soon enough, I said, my voice calm, steady. Just sit tight. The room fell into silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. They didn't know it yet, but their time was almost up. The silence didn't last long. It never does when fear starts creeping in. At first, it was subtle. Marcus shifting in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Lillian glancing around the room, her confidence wavering but not yet broken. Her friends exchanging uneasy looks, their laughter now fully extinguished. And then it happened. It started with Marcus. He leaned forward, clutching his chest, his face contorting in pain. "What the?" he gasped, but the words barely made it out before he doubled over, groaning loudly. "Marcus." Lillian's voice cut through the room, sharp and panicked. She rushed to him, her hands fluttering uselessly as she tried to figure out what was happening. "What's wrong? Talk to me." Before he could answer, another friend, a woman in a sparkling gold dress, let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her throat. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, her face pale as she struggled to breathe. "What's going on?" someone shouted. The man who'd tried to leave earlier suddenly dropped to his knees, gagging. His eyes bulged, and he clawed at his throat as if something invisible were choking him. Chaos erupted. Lillian's friends scattered like frightened animals, their polished facade crumbling in an instant. One woman screamed, running toward the door, only to collapse halfway there, clutching her stomach. Another man stumbled into a side table, sending a vase crashing to the floor as he struggled to stay upright. Lillian turned back to me, her face a mask of terror. "Michael!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "What's happening? What did you do?" I didn't answer. I just watched. Marcus was on the floor now, writhing in pain, his earlier arrogance reduced to desperate gasps. "Help me!" he choked out, his voice barely audible. "Please. Somebody call 911. One of the remaining friends shouted, fumbling for their phone, but their trembling hands were useless, and the phone slipped from their grip, clattering to the floor. Lillian was crying now, real tears, not the fake, manipulative ones she'd used on me so many times before. She dropped to her knees beside Marcus, shaking him as if that would make the pain stop. "What's happening to you?" she sobbed. "What's happening to all of us?" The room was a symphony of panic. Gasps, cries, the sound of furniture scraping against the floor as people stumbled and fell. I stayed seated, my expression calm, almost detached. "Michael!" Lillian screamed again, her voice raw. "Please, tell me what's going on." I tilted my head, studying her like she was a curious specimen in a lab. "You didn't care to listen when I walked in," I said evenly. "Why do you care now?" She blinked at me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "This isn't funny. Marcus, her voice broke as she looked back at him, writhing on the floor. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and fixed her with a cold stare. "Not so entertaining now, is it?" Her lips trembled, but she didn't respond. Behind her, another friend collapsed, their body convulsing as the room filled with panicked cries for help. And then came the sound I'd been waiting for. The wail of sirens in the distance. Lillian's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face full of hope. "The paramedics!" she cried, scrambling to her feet. "They'll fix this. Will they?" I cut in, my voice slicing through her hysteria. She froze, staring at me like I just sprouted a second head. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Do you think this is something they can fix, Lillian? Do you think all it takes is a few medics to undo what you've done?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time that night, I saw it. The realization that she was completely, utterly out of her depth. The sirens grew louder, closer, until flashing lights painted the windows red and blue. The first responders burst through the door moments later, their faces a mixture of urgency and confusion as they took in the scene. "What happened here?" one of them demanded, kneeling beside Marcus, who was now barely conscious. I stood up, brushing imaginary lint off my jacket. "That's a long story," I said, my tone calm and measured. "But let's just say they got exactly what they deserved." Lillian stared at me, her face pale and her lips trembling. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I looked at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us. "I gave you a taste of what it feels like to be powerless," I said finally. "And trust me, we're just getting started." As the paramedics scrambled to assess the scene, their frantic movements cutting through the chaos, I stood to the side, calm as a still pond. Lillian was clutching Marcus's arm, sobbing uncontrollably, while her so-called friends wailed like children lost in a storm. It was almost poetic, watching the mighty crumble. "Michael," Lillian whimpered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. "Please, what did you do?" Ah, the magic words. They'd been echoing in my head for weeks as I planned this night. I had waited for this exact moment, the moment her arrogance turned to desperation, her laughter to pleading. "What did I do?" I repeated, stepping forward, my voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the room. "Oh, Lillian, this isn't about what I did. It's about what you did." Her wide, tear-streaked eyes locked onto mine, searching for answers. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. Not after everything. "Let me break it down for you," I said, addressing not just her but everyone in the room. "You all thought you could laugh at me, mock me, treat me like a joke. But you didn't realize that the real joke was on you." Marcus groaned from the floor, his hand clutching his chest. This isn't funny," he rasped, his bravado entirely gone. "No, Marcus, it's not," I said, crouching down to meet his terrified gaze. "But it's fitting, don't you think? All those times you thought you were untouchable, sitting on your little throne of arrogance. How does it feel to have the rug pulled out from under you?" Lillian scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she reached for me. "Michael, whatever this is, I'm sorry, okay? Just stop it. Call them off, do something." I stepped back, letting her hands fall to her sides. "Sorry?" I echoed, laughing dryly. "You're sorry now? Funny how that works. You weren't sorry when you lied to my face, when you stole from me, when you paraded your little affair in front of everyone like it was a badge of honor." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She was like a fish out of water, gasping for something to hold on to. The paramedics, meanwhile, were frantically checking the victims. One of them approached me, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "Sir, these symptoms, they don't match anything we've seen. What's going on here?" I gave him a small, knowing smile. "Don't worry, they'll be fine. The effects are temporary." "What effects?" Lillian demanded, her voice cracking. "Michael, just tell us what you did." I turned to her, savoring the moment. "Fine. You want to know what I did? I'll tell you." I gestured to the scene around us. "The drinks you were all so happily indulging in? Let's just say they contained a little something extra. Nothing toxic, of course. I'm not a monster. But enough to give you all a taste of what it feels like to lose control." "You drugged us?" one of her friends shrieked, her face contorted with fear. "Calm down," I said, waving a hand dismissively. "It's a harmless compound. A little something I had a professional chemist whip up. It mimics the symptoms of a medical emergency. Chest pain, difficulty breathing, all that good stuff. But it's completely reversible. No lasting harm." Lillian's jaw dropped, and for a moment, she just stared at me, unable to process what I just said. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you do this?" I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "Because you needed to see what it feels like to be powerless. To have your world turned upside down in an instant. To face the consequences of your actions." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Michael, I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't even try to explain yourself. This isn't about us anymore, Lillian. This is about you, and what you've become." I turned to the rest of the room, addressing them like a teacher scolding unruly students. "You all thought you were invincible, didn't you? Thought you could do whatever you wanted without consequences. Well, consider this a lesson in humility." One of the paramedics stepped forward, clearly uneasy. "Sir, if this is all just some kind of stunt, you need to explain yourself to the authorities." "Oh, don't worry," I said, glancing at my watch. "They'll be here soon enough. And when they arrive, they'll have plenty of questions for everyone in this room." Lillian's face turned pale. "The police? You called the police?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course. This isn't just about your little affair, Lillian. This is about the fraud, the theft, the lies. You thought you were clever, siphoning money from our accounts to fund your little adventures. But you forgot one thing. I pay attention." Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and I knew the next phase of my plan was about to begin. Lillian sat slumped on the couch, her hands trembling, while Marcus lay sprawled on the floor, gasping like a fish out of water. The paramedics continued their frantic checks, but I could see the confusion in their faces. They didn't know what they were dealing with. Good. That was the point. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick folder, the papers inside neatly stacked and ready. I had spent weeks gathering this evidence, meticulously piecing together the puzzle of betrayal. And now, it was time to put it all on display. Since you're all so eager to know why this is happening, I began, my voice steady. Let me show you. I opened the folder, pulling out the first sheet, a bank statement. I walked over to the coffee table in the center of the room and slapped it down. This, I said, my tone sharp, is the first clue. A transaction from our joint account, $10,000, transferred to an account in Marcus's name. Lillian's head shot up, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. That's not. Don't, I interrupted, holding up a finger. Don't even try to deny it. I traced every single transfer. Small amounts at first, just enough to stay under the radar. But then you got greedy, didn't you, Lil? 10,000 here, 15,000 there. It adds up. I pulled out another paper, this one a hotel receipt. And here's where some of that money went. A luxury suite at the Grand Haven Hotel, booked under a fake name. But not just any fake name, your favorite pseudonym, Laura Banks. Ring a bell? Her face turned ashen. The others in the room were dead silent now, their earlier panic replaced by stunned disbelief. Even Marcus, who had been moaning and groaning moments ago, managed to lift his head and glare at Lillian. You used his money? He rasped. Oh, don't act like you're innocent in this, I snapped, tossing another paper onto the table. Here's a receipt for a watch, $2,000. Paid for with my money. And who's wearing that watch right now? Oh, right. You. Marcus instinctively glanced down at his wrist, where the gleaming watch sparkled under the light. His lips parted, but no words came out. Lillian tried to stand, her legs wobbling beneath her. Michael, listen, I can explain. Explain what? I barked, my voice rising for the first time. Explain how you betrayed me, how you stole from me, how you paraded your affair in front of everyone like I was too stupid to notice. She flinched, her tears flowing freely now. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean for it to go this far? Lillian, you planned every step of this. You thought you could have it all, the money, the affair, the lies, without facing any consequences. Well, guess what? The bill just came due. I turned to the others in the room, who were now watching with wide eyes, too shocked to speak. And as for the rest of you, I said, gesturing toward them, you're just as guilty. You laughed at me, mocked me, enabled her. You thought it was funny, watching her humiliate me. Well, is it funny now? No one answered. The sirens stopped outside, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the room. The police were here, right on time. Lillian's face turned even paler, if that was possible. The police, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Lillian, I said, my voice cold. The police. They're here to deal with the theft, the fraud, and whatever else they find in this den of arrogance you call a party. The front door burst open, and uniformed officers filed in, their faces grim as they took in the scene. One of them, a tall man with a commanding presence, approached me. We got a call about a medical emergency and potential illegal activity. What's going on here? I handed him the folder, my expression calm. Everything you need is in there. Bank statements, receipts, evidence of theft and fraud. It's all connected to her and him. I pointed to Lillian and Marcus, who looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. The officer opened the folder, scanning the contents. His jaw tightened as he read. This is serious, he said, motioning for another officer to take a closer look. Lillian dropped to her knees, her hands clasped together. Michael, please, she begged, her voice breaking. Don't do this. I'll fix it, I swear. I'll pay it all back. Just give me a chance. I stared down at her, the woman I had once loved, and felt nothing. No anger, No sadness, no pity. Just an overwhelming sense of closure. You had your chance, I said quietly, and you threw it away. The paramedics worked in overdrive, tending to the gasping, trembling bodies strewn across the floor. Lillian hovered near Marcus, her hands shaking as she tried to steady him, but her trembling voice betrayed her panic. "Please help him," she shrieked at the paramedics. "Do something. He's dying." One of the paramedics, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, glanced at her and shook her head. "He's not dying," she said curtly, "but he sure as hell thinks he is." Lillian froze, her wide eyes darting between Marcus and the paramedic. What do you mean?" The paramedic gestured to the group. "They're all experiencing the same symptoms. Chest tightness, dizziness, shortness of breath. Classic signs of a panic attack or something triggered. But we've checked their vitals. Heart rate's elevated, but nothing life-threatening." Lillian's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned to me, and her expression morphed from panic to anger. "Michael," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "You did this, didn't you? You poisoned us." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by her theatrics. "Poison? That's a strong word." "No, Lillian, I wouldn't stoop to that level. What you're all experiencing is, let's call it an educational moment." "Educational moment?" Marcus croaked, his voice weak but dripping with venom. "What kind of psycho are you?" I leaned down so only he could hear me. "The kind who doesn't let people walk all over him anymore." Before Marcus could respond, the lead paramedic approached me, her brow furrowed. "Sir, we need to know what they ingested to treat them properly. If you did something to their drinks, now's the time to tell us." I nodded calmly, pulling a small vial from my pocket and holding it up. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the overhead lights. "This," I explained, "is a harmless compound. Tasteless, odorless, and completely non-toxic. It mimics the symptoms of a heart attack for about an hour. Enough to make you think you're dying, but not enough to actually harm you." The paramedic took the vial, studying it with a mix of curiosity and irritation. "You're saying you deliberately spiked their drinks to induce panic?" "Yes," I said simply, meeting her gaze without flinching. "They needed to feel what it's like to lose control, to have their arrogance ripped away in an instant." She shook her head, clearly unimpressed. "This is unethical, bordering on criminal. I hope you're prepared to explain yourself when the police get here." "Oh, I'm prepared," I said, a faint smile playing on my lips. "But you might want to focus on them for now. They're the ones who thought they were invincible." Lillian, her face pale and streaked with tears, staggered toward me. "You've lost your mind," she hissed, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You're insane." I shrugged, unbothered by her insults. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just had enough of being the fool in your little game." At that moment, the front door burst open again, and the police strode in, their presence commanding. The lead officer scanned the room, taking in the chaos, the paramedics, the writhing bodies, the shattered glasses on the floor. "Who's in charge here?" he barked. "I am," I said, stepping forward with confidence. The officer narrowed his eyes at me, his gaze sharp. "We got a report of a medical emergency and possible illegal activity. Care to explain?" I handed him the folder I'd been carrying, the same one I'd given the paramedics earlier. "Everything you need is in there," I said. "Bank statements, receipts, evidence of theft and fraud. And if you want, I can explain exactly how they ended up like this." The officer flipped through the papers, his expression growing darker with each page. "You're telling me these people are involved in financial fraud?" "Yes," I said. "And that man," I pointed at Marcus, "is at the center of it." Marcus, still clutching his chest, tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. Lillian rushed to his side, her earlier anger replaced with desperation. "This is insane," she shouted. "Michael, stop this. Please." I shook my head slowly. "You had plenty of chances to stop, Lillian, to come clean, to end this madness before it got out of hand. But you didn't. And now, you're reaping what you sowed." The officer handed the folder to one of his subordinates, then turned back to me. "We'll take it from here," he said firmly. But you'll need to come with us too. We need a full statement about what happened here. Of course, I said, my voice calm. I'm more than happy to cooperate. As the officers began sorting through the chaos, I looked at Lillian one last time. Her face was a mixture of fury, fear, and something that almost looked like regret. But it was too little, too late. I turned away, my steps steady as I followed the officers outside. Behind me, the sound of pleading cries filled the air, a fitting soundtrack to the end of Lillian's arrogance. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, the chaotic sounds of the house fading behind me. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the driveway, casting long shadows across the carefully manicured lawn. I took a deep breath, letting the tension of the evening seep out of my chest. For the first time in months, I felt free. The officers who escorted me to their car weren't unkind, but they were clearly on edge. I could see the questions forming in their eyes, the quiet judgment in their stiff postures. I didn't care. I'd done what needed to be done, and I had no regrets. Inside the house, I could still hear Lillian's voice, shrill and desperate. She was pleading with the police, with the paramedics, with anyone who would listen. It's not what it looks like. This is a misunderstanding. Please, you have to believe me. But her words carried no weight anymore. The evidence was undeniable, and her carefully constructed facade was crumbling before her eyes. Marcus was less vocal, but I knew his silence wasn't born of dignity. It was defeat. He'd been caught, exposed for the leech he was, and now all he could do was sit in the wreckage of his own arrogance. His cries of pain had subsided into low groans, and I imagined he was already calculating how to shift the blame onto Lillian or someone else. Typical. The police officers began filing out of the house, leading Marcus in handcuffs. His once confident swagger was gone, replaced by a hunched posture and downcast eyes. When he spotted me, standing beside the squad car, his face twisted into a grimace. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice weak but venomous. I met his gaze, unflinching. "Oh, it's over," I said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." Lillian wasn't far behind, flanked by 2 officers. She wasn't cuffed yet, but the sheer humiliation on her face was enough to satisfy me. Her tear-streaked cheeks, the messy hair that had once been so carefully styled, the tremble in her voice. It was all a far cry from the smug, arrogant woman who had slapped me in front of her friends hours ago. "Michael," she called out, her voice breaking. "Michael, please, don't do this. We can fix this. We can." I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No, Lillian. You can't fix this. You broke it beyond repair. This isn't just about the affair, or the money, or the lies. It's about respect, something you stopped giving me a long time ago." Her lips trembled as she searched for something to say, some argument that could undo the damage. But there was nothing left. She knew it, and so did I. The officers led her to another car, and for a moment, she looked back at me, her eyes filled with something that almost resembled regret. But I wasn't moved. This wasn't a movie where the villain gets a last-minute redemption arc. This was real life, and in real life, actions have consequences. As the police cars pulled away, taking Lillian, Marcus, and their enablers with them, I stood alone in the driveway. The night was eerily quiet now, the stillness almost unsettling. But in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Over the following weeks, the fallout was swift and brutal. Lillian's name became a punchline in social circles, her reputation shredded by the scandal. Marcus's financial schemes came to light, and he faced charges that could keep him behind bars for years. The friends who had laughed at my humiliation scattered like cockroaches, each one desperate to distance themselves from the mess. As for me, I filed for divorce the next morning. There was no drawn-out legal battle, no dramatic confrontations. I had all the evidence I needed to ensure a clean break. Lillian tried to contact me, calls, texts, even showing up at my workplace, but I ignored every attempt. I was done. The house we once shared went on the market. I didn't want it anymore. It was filled with too many memories, most of them sour. I used the proceeds to buy a smaller, cozier place on the other side of town. A fresh start in every sense of the word. One night, weeks later, I sat on the porch of my new home, a glass of whiskey in hand. The stars were out, twinkling against the inky black sky, and the air was crisp and cool. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, the chaos of that night, and felt no bitterness. If anything, I felt a strange sense of gratitude, not for Lillian or Marcus or any of the pain they caused, but for the clarity it brought me. I had been blind, trapped in a cycle of complacency and denial, but now I saw things clearly. I took a sip of whiskey, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The man I was before that night, the passive, trusting, naive version of myself, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, wiser, and far less willing to tolerate disrespect. As I stared up at the stars, I whispered to myself, "Here's to new beginnings." And for the first time in years, I truly believed it.